Perfect. Yeah, so I'm Chris Carlson. It's amazing to be here. After the past 2 years, such a treat to be with friends old and new and see some amazing work. Yeah, thank you, Thorsten, and thank you, Gray Area, and to all of you for coming as well. This is just such a pleasure. So I'm here to talk to you about this app that I've been developing for now 10 years, as Thorsten mentioned. Hard to believe it's been that long. It's called Borderlands Granular, and it works with a technique called granular synthesis. If you're not familiar with that, it involves taking small fragments of sound and putting them together in different ways to create complicated evolving textures and timbres. And Borderlands is really focused on gesture and visual interaction with this technique. So before I go too much into it, I'll just do a quick fly-through sort of overview of the app with this demo. So yeah, that's pretty, thank you. Yeah, so pretty abstract kind of rundown of all the different ways that the app can work. But at the center of it all is this grain cloud. This is the object that you interact with when you're playing around with the app. You double tap on the screen and you get this blue circle which shows you where you can touch it. It's wide enough to fit 2 fingers in, 1 finger for dragging it and moving it around, 2 to rotate the cloud. Borderlands uses a technique called synchronous granular synthesis, so that means there's a regular pulse at which the grains trigger over time. But you can distribute the grains spatially around the screen, so every time it's time for a grain to trigger, it jumps to a new location within some predefined bounds and turns red and plays whatever sound is beneath it. And so as the grain plays, it fades and pulses back to kind of a white color, and if a grain doesn't land on a sound, it just triggers and doesn't play. So just a quick look at what a grain looks like in practice. Grains are made up of just a sound wave, which could be synthesized or sampled, and an envelope, which is essentially like taking a volume knob and fading it up and down to turn the sound on and off. And these envelopes can be different shapes, and the shape of the grain actually affects the timbre and quality of the output. So a single grain, a longer grain would sound like this. If you put a bunch of grains together, that's the cloud, and it can get much more complicated, more dense, and variable. All right, we'll move on from that. So kind of taking a deeper look at how things work in Borderlands, when you interact with the app, you create the grain cloud, and then you drag it around onto whatever sound files you've loaded in. The grains trigger randomly. Inside the center of the cloud, you have a Lissajous plot, which is showing kind of the harmonic content of the sound. And then the non-time dimension of the waveform changes the volume of the output. So that allows you to use gesture and kind of to drag over these sound files to create really expressive output and dynamic output. If you double tap, you get these parameters, which allow you to change things like how fast the grains trigger, how fast they play back inside their shape, and how much they overlap. And there's a whole bunch of other things that can be changed about the shape of the cloud and the way it evolves. And this can get really complicated when you add in a whole bunch of different sounds and start recording gesture, and we'll get into all the ways that can work later, but here's an example. All right, so we'll step back a little bit. I want to just take some time to reflect on the things that shape the way I listen to and approach sound, and why Borderlands exists, what drew me to granular synthesis. And so starting with that, I am reminded of this panel that I was on a few years back, and the question posed by the panel organizer was, what are the first sounds that you remember? And I think this is a really revealing question, because when you spend time thinking about this, it actually points you to some clues about how you listen to sound and the way you think about sound and how it works, and the sounds you're drawn to, what sounds stick out to you. So for me, I'm reminded of sounds of spaces that I loved growing up. In some cases, these are spaces or objects that do not exist anymore. So for example, the creaking of my grandmother's attic staircase, or the clatter of a wooden roller coaster at the amusement park near my hometown. Or even the way it felt to toggle the switches on my grandfather's organ and play around with sound there. So these are all sounds that are that for me hold emotional resonance, and when I think about them, I can almost feel them. There's a texture and a tactile quality to them. And when I was a kid, I had these walkie-talkies, which were kind of my first discovery of feedback. When you would hold them close together, you could sort of play them like a theremin. And it felt like, because you had the speakers in both hands, it actually felt like you were stretching out sound and pulling at threads of sound, because the feedback would change in pitch and kind of flip back and forth between different resonant modes. So it was this very visceral, tactile experience of working with sound that was kind of totally new to me as a kid. And similarly, I love that, with digital tools, my first experiences with working with something like SoundForge, seeing the shape of sound, the fact that you can cut and paste sound, you can take any length of time, copy it, put it next to another part of time, do it blindly, just grab little fragments, milliseconds, whatever, and create these hybrid sounds that are completely strange and a rearrangement of time itself. I love that, especially interfaces like this one, Pool, which is a collection of Max objects and patches that is kind of like a virtual modular synthesizer, but it's an interface that, when you look at this right away, it sort of forces you to wrestle with what it's doing, how to make it work together. It's not immediate. It's clear that it's been very well thought through, but it's also yeah, you have to work with it to get to something, but it's obvious that there's going to be some sort of interesting result if you do. So it's kind of a gradual interface. And ones like this one, which is Forester by Leafcutter John. And this, I believe it's a Max patch. You can load a whole bunch of sound files. They're just randomly thrown on screen, and you drag a cursor through this kind of forest of sounds and effects. And it's purely about listening and reacting to what you're hearing. There's not really, it's not clear what's going to happen. You just have to let it happen. And I love that. So when I listen to music, thinking about how I actually listen to music or sound, I love music that it's not quite clear what is going on, and you have to actually imagine what interface is being used to control it. And I think sometimes we can find clues to new ideas for how to make new musical interfaces. And that's actually what led me to Stanford University's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, which is also called CARMA. I did a master's degree there 10 years ago, and went there to learn about designing new interfaces for musical expression. So that's where Borderlands started. And my first project there was this really hacked together feedback device called the Feedbox, which just had a small battery-powered Radio Shack speaker sitting inside the box, and then 4 contact microphones positioned around the edges of the box. And these microphones were connected to foil pieces. The hot lead of the microphone was on the foil, and you had to actually put this foil on your fingers, hold the box, and touch the front plate to make connections of the microphones to the speaker. And this would result in crazy feedback and breaking connections, discontinuities, and it was really fun, but also not the most long-term practical kind of thing. Yeah, so that's that one. Yeah, then that led to this project, a group project called the Sound Flinger, and this one, you have kind of imagine a virtual perimeter, a circle inside these, in between all these faders that are shown up there. You can record 2 virtual sound objects, and these are motorized faders, so you can actually grab the sound objects and kind of wiggle them and fling them around a 4-channel sound system. This was really fun and totally weird, but you know, kind of was limited in use. And then a sound art project, which was inspired by synchronous fireflies. This one had a processing app running on a BeagleBoard device, sitting up in a thing kind of above the person's head in this photo. And the whole idea was that, you know, synchronous fireflies respond to what their neighbors are doing. They adjust their cycles, and eventually there's kind of this spontaneous synchrony that emerges. So this was playing with that idea and using custom 555 timer circuits to make weird chirpy noises, and you know, it would react to when someone walked through. So all of those projects were super fun and really great opportunities to explore different ways of working with sound. But I felt like I wanted to do something more. You know, I wanted something that would grow and be a platform where I could add new ideas in. And what I was looking for really was how to make an instrument. And at the time, I was also avoiding, I think, having to learn C++ and OpenGL because it felt quite intimidating. But you know, that's what was necessary. And you know, this project by Tariq Bari is a great example of a tool, not actually in C++. It's JavaScript and Max and a bunch of other pieces. But it's something that he uses for designing 3D sound worlds, but also creating visuals for artists. And I think it's amazing the way this kind of tool can grow with you and can allow you to create and insert your voice. So I ended up taking this class called Music, Computing, and Design, and that's where Borderlands got its start. And the final project for that class was to design and build an instrument in C++ and OpenGL and give a performance with it. I knew I wanted to work with granular synthesis because I had tried out a bunch of granulators in the past and loved the way that it kind of embodied all of those qualities that I described, that sound is tactile, that you can rearrange it, that it is texture. But you know, many granular synthesis interfaces are very UI heavy, or at least they were at the time. You'd have a lot of knobs, you'd have a lot of abstract interfaces. And you know, in this project, we had to work with C++ and OpenGL, and I didn't know how to make a button in OpenGL. I didn't know how to make a knob or you know, put text on the screen. It was just, you know, but I knew how to draw shapes. I knew how to do that from doing processing and working with other creative coding frameworks. So I decided I would try to make a visual interface for granular synthesis and start simple with just drawing some shapes. Of course, I was also a little over-optimistic, and you know, my first inspiration for this was this piece by Robert Henke and Christopher Botter, which is a physical performance piece. But I loved this image of these balloons floating in this terrain that can evolve over time. And to me, it evoked the idea of granular synthesis, or the way I thought about granular synthesis looking. So my early sketches were kind of around this, thinking about you know, particle surfaces and generating scanners that can go through them and maybe like operate in little micro regions, or you know, tubes going through frames that are physically modeled and scanning around different sound files. But you know, learning OpenGL and C++ is a lot in like a 5-week period to do a full 3D model of a system and then figure out how to make it controllable and make a compelling performance. So that kind of forced me to collapse this into the 2D plane. And led to this idea of, well, what if I just take sound files and bring them into the center of this XY region and granulate on top of them? So that's kind of how Borderlands was born. So I went from this like Robert Henke 3D terrain thing to something more akin to this visual music work by Oscar Fischinger with these amazing, you know, this is a beautiful stop motion animation, which I love, and you know, kind of think about a lot when I think about how the grains look in Borderlands. The first iteration of Borderlands actually was just this very tiny prototype in processing. Like I said, I knew how to draw shapes, so I started by drawing some rectangles on the screen and seeing how it felt to just drag them around, resize them. What would it look like to select multiple or select through to get a different one, testing out all those ideas. And then the final result of that was a desktop version of the app, which looked like this. Yeah, you launched it from the terminal. You had to do keyboard shortcuts to change parameters and click the mouse, and that was really it. It loaded a bunch of sounds on startup and couldn't do anything like preset saving or any other complex behavior. It was just this kind of single ephemeral experience, and this is how that worked. You could flip sounds out of the way to make these sort of sudden dynamic changes. And amazingly, this thing still compiles and runs on this new MacBook Pro. I did the screen capture last week, so I think that just speaks to the simplicity of the code and that, I mean, I can't believe that it still does run. So, so I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. This was 2011, and the iPad 2 came out right in the middle of this, and that was the first iPad that was capable of running anything like Borderlands that could perform well enough to actually run in real time. So the first iteration of this was for the follow-on class to that initial one, which was called Mobile Music. And it's very clearly a port of the original version, except instead of since there's no keyboard and mouse, or there wasn't at the time, for iPads, I needed to find a way to bring the parameters in. And so that led to this sort of radial interface of interacting with the parameters off the edge of the grain cloud. A few months later, the first version went into the store. Again, this was very much a prototype. It could load sounds at startup. You had to create a Borderlands playlist in iTunes and load it in and spell it the right way. And it was as clunky as it sounds. But it did have UI buttons, and there was some more kind of iOS-centric behavior. And also the sounds were freed up from this kind of XY grid. Now that you could rotate them and zoom them and move them around. And this version, was out for a few months, and I got this random email a few months after that, after it had gotten some press, and they said, hey, how's the live performance with your app? Can you do a set at Sónar in Barcelona? And for me, that was like, terrifying, because the app could run for maybe 5 minutes. Sometimes it would crash on load. It only could load one set of sounds, and I had to make 40 minutes of music. And this was 3 weeks before the festival was going to happen. That pressure led to me kind of having to think through, like, how would I turn this into something that's, a sound design tool, which is the way I thought about it, as more of a kind of a toy and an interesting experiment, to something that could be used in a live setting and be stable and run well. That led to the creation of the ability to save and load presets. And then also when I went to do this show, I basically had it set up so I would do 2 iPads and load a set of sounds, work with them over here, load the next one, move over here, kind of like having 2 turntables to work with. And it helped me also think about how I interact with the app directly and the way gesture plays into it and the way dynamics play into it to create something more compelling. So here's just a little blip from that performance. So that was the start of version 2 of the app, which is actually, in my mind, the first real full-featured version. In 2015, this came out with the ability to save and load scenes, the ability to record in real time, to record gesture and automate it, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And this is where the app kind of really got its legs, I think. And since then, I've released one more version in 2020 with some more features just kind of piled in, but always keeping this idea of the open canvas and the open interaction. One of the biggest challenges in developing this is adding features without kind of corrupting the interface. Yeah, this app is, every time I add a new feature, it's all about organizing grains of sound, thinking about new ways to work with this technique and allow for interesting results to occur. And I was looking back at some of the granular synthesis literature, and Barry Truax, who is the first person who did real-time granular synthesis, talks about organizing grains as kind of abandoning linear thinking, linear compositional thinking, and looking into more process-oriented strategies. And Curtis Rhodes talks about making processes that are narrative in function, or adding kind of an emotional arc to it. And when I think about Borderlands and kind of my view of what it feels like to interact with it, I'm reminded of this poem by A.R. Ammons, which I'll read. I will try to fasten into order enlarging grasps of disorder, widening its scope, but enjoying the freedom that scope eludes my grasp, that there is no finality of vision, that I have perceived nothing completely, that tomorrow a new walk is a new walk. And I love this because it's about the experience of walking in nature and doing the same walk through this place, Corson's Inlet, but seeing something different every day. And Borderlands is really about this. It's about wandering through the sonic wilderness and seeing what you discover. And that's why the app presents you with this open canvas. At the start, it starts off blank every time. There's not like a preset saved loaded thing that just loads whatever you did last time. It always forces you to kind of start at the beginning. And it emphasizes the sounds and the clouds and how you touch them and interact with them. And there's always new ways to kind of dig into the sound and find new spaces within those sounds. One of the interesting things in the design of the app is that the sound files themselves are brought into the realm of interaction and gesture as well. So it's not just about the synthesis technique. It's about moving these files around, arranging them on screen, stretching them and zooming them, making it as fluid as possible. Everything in the app has kind of an inertia to it, so you can throw it and it'll slide across the screen. So the goal is to make it feel really natural and fluid to interact with. And here's a little example just showing kind of all the different ways that these elements collide. So as you can see there at the end, part of the app is also about playing with precision and randomness. So you can spatially distribute these grains, and there's a couple ways that I've seen people work with it and ways that I prefer to work with it. One of which is to scatter the grains across the screen and just see what you get back. This is a scene from the most recent version, a preset created by an artist named Micronesia, which is all about kind of creating a virtual zoo. And this uses grain clouds that have their grains distributed all the way across the screen. But then you can also stack the grains on top of each other and use these clouds to scrub through sound and really dig into spaces between transients, or maybe even just settle on a transient and see what noise and texture emerges from it. So this example shows using the iPad's accelerometer to actually scrub in real time through a sound file and perform that sound file by tilting the iPad. All right, so I love that these techniques, especially the kind of stacked grains technique, is really kind of evocative of the feeling of touching sound. And so the visual design of the app also takes this into consideration. Interacting with a glass screen is pretty unsatisfying compared to touching a MIDI controller or playing a guitar. It doesn't give you a lot of feedback. So the app leans into visual feedback more heavily to try to enhance the sense of kind of breaking through that barrier. So one example of this is that when you have something automated and you've recorded gesture into it, these little white rings appear around the parameters. You also have the feedback of what audio the cloud is producing. If a cloud is particularly loud, you can see it because this visual in the center is reflecting that. And then there's just little subtle details that I've worked on adding into the app to try to help it feel just a little bit more natural when you're touching it, like the pulsing parameter pads or discrete parameter sliders that animate the steps in and out. Or the way a sound file highlights itself when you touch it, because often these sound files are overlapping each other and it can be hard to discern the bounds of the rectangle. To things like more functional feedback that shows, this cloud has an envelope and it's not active unless you touch it, and it fades in when it's active. And recently I've been exploring actually visualizing the underlying granular synthesis, showing the playheads within the app, which helps show the shape of the grains as they evolve and what's actually happening underneath the surface. So every new feature that I work on for this app is all about creating new pathways for discovery. And I liked what Mark Fell said earlier about preferring simple interfaces that allow for emergent complexity, and that's something that I really strive for in the app. All you have to do to work with this app is know how to double tap and drag, and the app tells you to do that when you start, and the rest is there for discovery. So here are a couple of features that I've worked on in the past couple of years that I think really help increase the amount of complexity that's possible with the app. We'll start with automation. So I've always been fascinated by interfaces that allow you to record gesture and play it back to loop control data. So in Borderlands, you can record the position of a cloud, and you press the button and the cloud cues itself. It turns white, and then it turns red when you start recording. It gives you this little ring to tell you it's doing it. One of the tricky things is that if a cloud is automating, it can be hard to touch, especially if you've moved real fast. And so recently I added this thing called a ghost cloud, where you can, in a background touch, so you can touch the background and reveal the ghost cloud, allow it to keep automating, but then you can stop, the cloud stops, and you can open it up and edit it. And this is especially useful if you have the automation speed cranked way, way up, because you can still get in there and change the sound file. Or change the parameters, rather. You can automate parameters, and they just start going once you release your touch. And then if you have a cloud open for editing and you've made a whole bunch of changes to it, you can actually just double tap again and the cloud will get duplicated. If you don't want to duplicate it, you just close it and you create a new cloud and it starts at the defaults. But this is great because otherwise you find yourself configuring clouds over and over and over. And sometimes it's nice to just start with what you've made and build off of that. Normally when you throw a cloud off the screen, it gets deleted, but there's also an option where you can turn on some edge behavior where the clouds can actually jump back to the other side, kind of Pac-Man style. So that gets really interesting if you're automating the clouds and then you start tilting the iPad with gravity. And then with the duplication, you can create these kind of choruses of clouds that have similar behavior. And the nice thing about the duplication is that all of the parameters remain synced with their parent cloud that they were copied from. At least initially. You can edit them and change them. So here's another example of the background touch. One thing, once I started adding the one touch to reveal the ghost clouds, I realized, oh, why don't I just track a couple more touches and see what happens there. So you can pause the position automation, and you can also pause any parameter automation by adding 2 or 3 fingers in addition. It's kind of hard to see, but my fingers are over here. I like this because it allows you to create sort of stuttering pauses that can sometimes uncover interesting textures. All right, so granular synthesis, and especially synchronous granular synthesis, is also inherently rhythmic. If you space grains out enough, you end up with a pulse or a rhythm, especially if you work with a grain shape that is starts with a decay, a pulse and a decay, like an exponential decay. So in the most recent version, I added the ability to use tempo sync and to sync with Ableton via Ableton Link. You can change the sync division per cloud, and clouds can opt into or out of being tempo synced. And then the beat division, or the beat multiplier, like a triplet or dotted or other weird fractions, can be controlled independently to create kind of these sudden variations. And you also have probability control to create polyrhythms where sometimes grains won't trigger. And here's just a few different examples of using tempo sync, starting with this left one, which is granulating a real-time input of a synthesizer. This takes the BPM all the way up to 999. So when you get to those, oh wait, I'm not sure which one's going to play now. When you get to those higher BPMs, it starts to turn into something more tonal. Let's see, I think this is going to go in the wrong order, so, all right, let's see. Oh wait, I'll have to, how do I do this? Let's let this finish playing, sorry. Oh, do it again. My mouse to activate these individually. So, all right. Oh gosh, all right. Forget that. All right. Let's see here. I'm going to pause this one, start this one. This one is just kind of more traditional rhythmic stuff. All right, and then final video of this one is when you get the grains going fast enough, you actually can use the rhythmic divisions to generate sort of melodic sequences. And bend that pitch using the BPM control. All right, so the last feature I wanted to talk about is real-time input. And Borderlands kind of takes a slightly different approach to this as well. You can get a real-time buffer. You can add more than one, and it's the same input stream. Eventually, there will be the option to add different streams, but that requires some additional UI and menus. But I still think this is valid to have the same audio coming in multiple shapes because these can be rearranged and layered in different ways. So the different time elements of the buffer overlap, and that can create some unpredictable results. Borderlands also has 2 looping modes, so you can go create a loop, or you can have it go as sort of like a real-time stream or waterfall input to granulate the input as it flows by. All right, let's see here. And if you touch one of the real-time loops and change its mode, you enter this sort of hybrid state where some are going one way, some are doing the other. And if you touch that button again, it just toggles everybody to the opposite state. So with things being laid out all over the canvas, this can create some really interesting, unpredictable variation. And when you create a scene that has real-time buffers and save it, when it's recalled, it loads back in with the playheads all offset at the same amount and empty buffers. So this makes it possible to create custom granular processors that have configurations of clouds and sounds however you want them to be. All right, so just this last video shows all this stuff kind of working in sequence with just a little real-time input improvisation. All right, so yeah, I love working on this app. It's such a great thing to be able to explore different ideas I have with sound, and there's a lot that I want to do going forward. It's something that I work on in my spare time, so it's very slow. But yeah, I think one of the most exciting things that I'm working on is opening it up with OSC and MIDI control so that instead of adding controllers into the interface, controllers and sequencers and things could be made like a Max for Live device or perhaps some other custom controller, maybe controlled via an art installation. I'm interested in saving cloud presets so that you don't have to reconfigure things all the time and maybe creating individual kind of parameter sequencers per cloud. Making group selections so that you can merge clouds into formations, thinking about different types of triggering modes, maybe even adding different ways of manipulating the sound files too, like slicing them and reversing them, having them scroll or play back even if they're not recording. And also, more practical matters like getting it on different platforms and formats. So, for me, this app has been an amazing thing to work with, and I've just been so lucky to have this kind of platform to try out ideas. And it's really about playing with sound. And as I design it and I think about it now, it's really aimed at being operational and usable in a whole bunch of different contexts, whether it's in the recording studio for sound design or on stage, in a field in Finland recording reindeer fences and improvising with mobile devices, or even in the classroom. My friend Tobias did these amazing workshops with kids with Borderlands to help them learn about digital audio. And the fact that the app is simple and can be understood by kids, I think is just really, for me, really rewarding to be able to communicate these ideas at any level. And so, in its entirety, it's really about the joy of exploring sound. And I'm just excited to keep working on this project, and I will leave you with the trailer, or the teaser from the most recent version, which is now very old. It was in 2020, but still the latest kind of hype video for the app. So here you go. Thanks so much. Thank you.